philosophy. And I've been reading this book by Friedrich Nietzsche, Beyond Good and Evil, and it is by far the best book that I've ever read. Now, when you're reading a book like this, it's a bit different than reading a book normally because most books will tell you flat out, the authors will just tell you exactly what they're trying to convey, exactly what they're trying to get across. And it's not every book, but it's more prominent in some books rather than others. And this is a book where it's like taking a walk in the forest and you're collecting gold coins, but you don't know how many are out there. And you can go out there on your own and you might get 5 gold coins, you might get 10, but then, there's other people that'll get 50 or they'll get 100, or someone like Jordan Peterson might get, you know, 200 gold coins. And that's why it's valuable to listen to somebody like Jordan Peterson break down someone like Nietzsche. But trying to read this, you have to really think about it. You have to think about everything all the way through because during the end of Nietzsche's life, as he was writing this, he was pretty sick. And he had to spend more time thinking than writing because writing exerted quite a bit of energy for someone who was in his physical state at the time. And what ended up coming of that was you can see it's a fairly short book, but it's dense. It's very, very information dense. And every word is chosen very precisely. There's no sentence that's unneeded. There's no word that's a lower resolution version than he could use. And it's a very interesting idea that he lays forth, and that's that we have this conception of truth that it should serve some objective reality. But Nietzsche says that truth should serve life. And that's fundamentally different from what every other philosopher up to Nietzsche's time has really thought about the world and about reality and how people should behave. There's this thought that if you know everything, if you have absolute knowledge, then you know how to act in the world, and that's not necessarily true. So I'm going to get into, there's one paragraph in here in particular I'm going to get into. The entire first chapter of this book is called The Prejudices of Philosophers, and it's really interesting. It breaks down everything in a very succinct way. But then you get into the second chapter, and instead of just looking at the prejudices of philosophers, he starts to answer some of the questions that he asked in the first chapter, or that were left open-ended because of previous philosophers' inability to dig as deep as Nietzsche is and to conceptualize things in the way that he is. So the chapter 2 is called The Free Spirit, and I'll put the pictures up on screen of the book so you can see it, but it's essentially the 25th chapter, or the 25th paragraph in the book, and he numbers each paragraph. And the way that his paragraphs are set up is more like separate notions or epiphanies that he had that were then ordered in specific ways. So it's like each paragraph is its own thought, but it loosely builds on the previous thought and it sets up the next. So this paragraph, this is the second paragraph in the second chapter. And in the first paragraph, he's talking about how people have this innate desire to simplify the world. And it's involuntary, you can't really get around it. And in the first chapter, he talked about a will to knowledge. And he said that a will to knowledge is the result of some deeper impulse. And in the second chapter, he gets into what that deeper impulse is. And he says that it's a will to ignorance because people have this drive to simplify the world, to reduce things down and to make it easier. He says that one of the problems with language is that language sets up ignorance and knowledge like they're opposites, or like it's a dichotomy. And he says that that's not how it is. It's a scale. And all that knowledge is a refinement of ignorance. So when people have a will to knowledge, they have a will to refinement of the ignorance. And that's a really interesting way to think about it, because, well, it opens up a whole new realm of questions now. And he gets into that in this paragraph that I'm going to read. After such a cheerful commencement, he's talking about saying that we simplify the world down. After such a cheerful commencement, a serious word would fain be heard. It appeals to the most serious minds. Take care, ye philosophers and friends of knowledge, and beware of martyrdom, of suffering for the truth's sake, even in your own defense. It spoils all the innocence and fine neutrality of your conscience. It makes you headstrong against objections and red rags. It stupefies, animalizes, and brutalizes when in the struggle with danger, slander, suspicion, expulsion, and even worse consequences of enmity. Ye have at last to play your last card as protectors of truth upon earth, as though the truth were such an innocent and incompetent creature as to require protectors. So what he's getting into here is telling people to be careful not to martyr themselves for what they deem to be the truth, because what they deem to be the truth can constantly be refined, because it's a constant refinement of knowledge. You should never feel like you have absolute knowledge of something. Basically, that's what he's saying when he says you can martyr yourself. Like, be careful not to martyr yourself for the truth. Because, first of all, the truth, it's not this fragile being that needs protection. And it's also not something that people can conceptualize all that well. And even if they think they can conceptualize it pretty well, there's still oceans of information that they need that they don't have. And you of all people, ye knights of the sorrowful countenance, messers, loafers, and cobweb spinners of the spirit, finally ye know sufficiently well that it cannot be of any consequence if ye just carry your point. And when he says to just carry your point, he means to follow it to its logical end, to think it all the way through, to question your a priori presuppositions. He doesn't mean like hold on to your point and physically carry it and be dogmatic with it. That's not what he's meaning, because in a more modern sense, I can see how that could be misinterpreted to be that way. But he means to think it through logically and really carry it to its end. And, what will that end be? Ye know that hitherto no philosopher has carried his point, and that there might be a more laudable truthfulness in every little interrogative mark which you place after your special words and favorite doctrines, and occasionally after yourselves, than in all the solemn pantomime and trumping games before accusers and law courts. So what he's saying here is that up to his point in the late 1800s, no philosopher, no philosophy has really carried its point all the way through, because they run into these unconscious and involuntary presuppositions that they set forward. And that's a lot of what the first chapter was Nietzsche breaking these a priori presuppositions down, and he really lays bare the foundation of philosophy and shows how philosophers have for so long just been puppets to their own impulses and desires. And when he says that there might be a more laudable truthfulness in every little interrogative mark, what he's saying is that there is a deeper truth. There's something more to be found when you question your own beliefs and your own special words and doctrines and your own ideology, rather than questioning everyone else. That's essentially what he's getting to here. Rather, go out of the way, flee into concealment, and have your masks and your ruses, that ye may be mistaken for what you are, or somewhat feared. And what he's saying here is that, you have the option. You can go be isolated, be in your little echo chamber, and wear your mask. And something that's really interesting is the way that the Greeks thought of masks, where it was like a persona, so that you could, that's why Greek masks had holes cut out in the mouths, so that persona literally means sound through. So it allows you to sort of have this image that you display to others and to the public, and to be able to speak your being through the mask of that. And that's sort of what he's getting to here. And then I'm going to skip a little bit ahead here. He says, choose the good solitude, the free, wanton, lightsome solitude, which also gives you the right still to remain good in any sense whatsoever. So what he's saying here is to choose the good isolation. Be isolated voluntarily. Find solitude voluntarily. Don't be forced into it. And that's important because when you're forced into it, it's almost like having something taken from you. It's like having a degree of freedom taken from you. He goes on, how poisonous, how crafty, how bad does every long war make one which cannot be waged openly by means of force. And what he's getting to here is that when you have an issue that you fight about, you can't just have this all-out war about it. So what ends up happening is that it gets bottled up and it gets kind of like it bubbles to the surface at certain points, but it never fully releases all the tension. And that's kind of what he's getting to here, because so a good example is if there's a hummingbird out the window and your significant other says, "Oh, come look at this hummingbird." And you go, "Okay." And then you go and look at it. It's like you're not upset that you have to go look at a hummingbird. Like, that's not what the tension is. The tension is, maybe something like, "Oh, you always tell me to come look at these stupid things. I never have any interest in them. And you having an interest in them isn't enough for me to have an interest in them. And I don't care about what you're doing. I have more important things to be doing." And it's like that, and it can expand beyond that. It can grow, and tension can grow. And there can be so much more below that that people tend to just miss. And that's what he's getting to, is when you can't just get to the root cause of an issue, it makes you poisonous and crafty and bad. And it's very true. And it starts to instill this poison in the person, in the personality of the person themselves. But he's going to compare this to something else when he says, when you have to bottle up these tensions for decades, saying it makes someone poisonous and crafty and a bad person. So then he says, how personal does a long fear make one? A long watching of enemies, of possible enemies. And what he's getting to here is that when you have a fear that's instilled and you don't know, the fear isn't justified by a complete understanding of what the fear is, then it tends to make people exhausted. It tends to exhaust your spirit and your soul. And it's something that you're constantly looking for enemies. And it's like this hyper vigilance as to what's around you, and you're constantly looking for these enemies. And it's a fundamental drive of people to be looking for enemies or things that would cause harm to them. And that's obvious, because people are living beings. We're trying to continue our life. So it makes sense that we're hyper aware of things like this. And he's saying, so how personal does a long fear make one? So the more that you dwell on a certain fear, as large and abstract as it could be, it'll get more personal the more that you internalize it, and the more that you feel like it's a fear or more a threat directed at you from something that you should be fearing. It says, these pariahs of society, these long pursued, badly persecuted ones, also the compulsory recluses, the Spinozas or Giordano Brunos, always become, in the end, even under the most intellectual masquerade, and perhaps without being themselves aware of it, refined vengeance seekers and poison brewers. And I'm not familiar with Spinoza or Giordano Bruno's philosophies. I'm not familiar with any of that. So that would be something to read, and it would be more interesting. But from context clues, you can kind of gain that at the end of their philosophy is martyrdom of whoever believes that philosophy and adopts it. And that's why he says that they're refined vengeance seekers and poison brewers. So they're poison brewers because their philosophy then infiltrates the minds of other people and gets them to martyr themselves on this conception of truth that's laid out in their philosophy. And Nietzsche says that that's a bad thing, to martyr yourself on something that you believe to be the truth, when it's really, life is a constant refinement of ignorance. It's a constant search for absolute truth. And I'll get into that more after I finish reading over this. Okay, and to finish up that sentence, I'll start the sentence over, but it continues on. He says, okay, these pariahs of society, these long pursued, badly persecuted ones, also the compulsory recluses, the Spinozas or Giordano Brunos, always become, in the end, even under the most intellectual masquerade, and perhaps without being themselves aware of it, refined vengeance seekers and poison brewers, not to speak of the stupidity of moral indignation, which is the unfailing sign in a philosopher that the sense of philosophical humor has left him. He's saying basically that when the philosophical humor has left a philosopher, it's a sign that they're no longer questioning their own philosophy. They're no longer questioning their own doctrines or their own ideology. And that it's basically nihilism, where you're taking an absolute, or it's nihilism in the sense that you're taking a certain nothing over an uncertain something. So it's like taking everything that could be true and reducing it down to one point and just saying, no, this is what's true. This is absolutely what's true, without any or without any more knowledge than one would have to get a collection of things that could be true. And this is pretty abstract. You'd have to read this book to really, I don't know, I'm not aware of how much I'm saying is really linking up or making a whole lot of sense with people, because I've read the first parts of this book and I've listened to other philosophers. So it's tough for me to tell, but if you have questions, drop them in the comments and I'll try to answer all of them. Like I love talking about this stuff. I love answering questions on it. So we'll continue on here. The martyrdom of the philosopher, his sacrifice for the sake of truth, forces into the light whatever of the agitator and actor lurks in him. So basically, when you martyr yourself, when you sacrifice yourself for some absolute truth, you're laying the foundation of who you are out for people to see. You're bringing whatever of, he says, the actor or the agitator lurks in somebody. So when you go to defend the truth, or what you believe to be the truth, when you go to martyr yourself on the truth, any anger that you have or any false pretenses that you hold that aren't logical, but you just hold them for any number of reasons, those come to the forefront and those are exposed now. So when somebody is angry or indignified, you now see who they really are. You now see what they're really trying to get to. And I don't know, in most people, that's not always something that they're aware that they're doing. Most of the times people don't know that that's what they're doing. And if you really want to get to know someone, you just listen to them. Just listen to them talk, because they'll tell you exactly what they're up to. And if one has hitherto contemplated him only with artistic curiosity, with regard to many a philosopher, it is easy to understand the dangerous desire to see him also in his deterioration. Deteriorated into a martyr, that is. So what he's getting to here is that when a philosopher only contemplates his own doctrines or his own ideology with an artistic curiosity, which I take to mean like a lighthearted kind of speculation, but not really all that deep. What he's saying is that when a philosopher does that, it's easy to see why they would want to deteriorate themselves into a martyr, and it's because they think that then they have the absolute truth. Then they know what the end goal is, and that's what people are after. They're trying to get to the end. And to get to the end, you have to feel like you know what the end is. And that's basically what he's getting to here when he says that, it's a dangerous desire, because it's something that could suck you in, and it sucks in a lot of philosophers, often unconsciously. Only that it is necessary with such a desire to be clear what spectacle one will see in any case. So where will What is the end goal of this desire? Where will it end up? He says, merely a satiric play, merely an epilogue farce, merely the continued proof that the long, real tragedy is at an end, supposing that every philosophy has been a long tragedy in its origin. And this is really genius because it's really tying everything that he's been saying together, where there's not some little intricacy in a philosophy that's wrong. There's not some little bit that just doesn't seem to be right. It's the fact that a philosophy has an end. It's the fact that there is this absolute truth that they're offering, that they're saying people, believers of that philosophy, can martyr themselves on. And that's where Nietzsche's idea of truth-serving life is so different, because absolute truth would serve absolute life, and you don't know what serves absolute life unless you have an infinite time scale. So there is no end, really, to Nietzsche's philosophy that truth serves life. And that's how his is so much different than any other philosophy that's come before him and any that I've read post-Nietzsche. So I hope that you guys found this interesting. I do have some other thoughts I'm going to share on this. I'm going to think about it a little bit more, formulate these thoughts a little bit better, and then I'll be sure to add this as a little bit onto the end of this video. So you probably noticed that there's quite a bit more to watch in this video. So thank you guys so much for watching this, and I hope you enjoy what else I have to say. Now, there's something else that I could feel was left unattended to while I was going through the paragraph, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it at the time, but I've taken the opportunity now to really collect my thoughts, and I want to articulate something else that I was thinking about while reading through Nietzsche. So, something that Nietzsche frequently does, at least far more frequently than most others, is not redefine terms, but remind us of what they really mean. So when Nietzsche makes his claim that the driving force in humans is a will to power, he's trying to get people out of thinking in a box about what power means. And I think Nietzsche does the same thing when he talks about knowledge. Scientifically minded people think of knowledge as something that yields an objective truth, when that isn't quite the entirety of what knowledge is. Knowledge is also partially society's subjective understanding of objective events. And since you can't group the thoughts of society together as being uniform, each needs to be considered separately. And this gets us to the idea that the West pioneered, that you can divide humans into fractal groups until you get to the individual, because every person is an individual at their core, partially because of the fact you're a cultural phenomena, partially because you're a biological phenomena, and partially because you have experiences independent of everyone else. So this means that to understand society's view of something, you need everyone's complete subjective understanding of their objective reality. Now you could say, well, who cares about that? What does it matter what other people think? And I would say the answer to that is quite clear. You care. Understanding how other people subjectively feel about objective events is how we as individuals are able to align our desires and impulses with those of other people. And aligning our desires is critical, because otherwise we'd constantly be at war, either literal war the way that we think of it now, or just internal wars between people. There would be constant friction among people, because there would be no ability to see that compromise and voluntary exchange can produce more wealth for multiple people than they'd be able to produce independently. This ties into a John C. Calhoun line from his Disquisition on Government, which I've wrongly attributed this line in the past to Murray Rothbard, so I'm just going to correct that now. But John C. Calhoun says that man has a drive to live in society because there's no other way that man could fully develop his moral or intellectual faculties or raise himself above the level of the brute creation. Now, when I say compromise and voluntary exchange produces more wealth for multiple people than they'd be able to independently produce on their own, you have to broaden the definition of wealth, because I don't just mean money. Wealth is meant more in the way of what could be considered total water and nutrients to grow the plants of life. Compromise and voluntary exchange can create a more flourishing garden of humanity than several plants isolated from each other. So This means that you need society's help to refine your own knowledge to any degree that could be considered new terrain or infinite in respect to the rest of humanity. And if you don't have knowledge on how the people that make up society view specific topics, it could prove to be a detriment to actually refining one's own knowledge. And this is because you can't get in the spotlight and have a serious conversation about something like culture and IQ without being severely ostracized. You can't get in the spotlight and have a serious conversation about certain conspiracy theories because you'll be cast out as insane. And for many people who would even have the opportunity to be in the spotlight, this kind of misstep could cost them a lot of future refinement of knowledge. So without knowing how to properly approach certain topics, you could be at a disadvantage. And this shows that knowledge doesn't end with an objective understanding of the world. And it's also worth adding that you could make the claim that even though it's someone else's subjective interpretation you're after, when you interpret it, it's now objective, and I'd say even that isn't true. If you understand someone else's subjectivity objectively, then do you really understand them? Is it really the same unconscious processes at work? I'd say no. People are engulfed by an ideology, and without understanding the impulses that govern their thought processes and how those work in tandem with each other, there's a key element missing. It's similar to the difference between objectively knowing you should do something and knowing at the core of your being you should do something. It's like a New Year's resolution. You objectively know what you should do, but to really do it effectively, you need to reorganize your value structure, or at the least manipulate the current value structure to include refinements. And an example of what I mean with that statement is that if a piece of your value structure is be healthy, then new information can change how you work towards that goal without actually changing that goal. But, what is nearly every piece of a value structure, if not simply a piece of either some more abstract structure or composed of several more intricate values? Because Nietzsche would argue that the primary value in life is that which furthers life. So basically, to try to tie this whole point together, the objective truth has a finite end. It's vast, and to a person's conceptual ability, it seems endless, but it's not. More objective truth isn't created out of the pursuit of absolute truth. Even if we don't understand it, it's always there. However, out of the idea that knowledge includes an understanding of people's subjective interpretation of objective events is the endless building of future interpretations on the objective knowledge and events that take place. And those will continue to happen as long as conscious life exists. This means that if you could know everything about the objective world, it could be given to you in one collection. And while seemingly huge, it's not infinite. However, if you could know everything about the subjective interpretation of the objective world, it would be an infinite entity constantly shifting and changing its inner structure. So, I hope that this opened the door on Nietzsche a bit more to people. If you have any interest in buying Beyond Good and Evil, I highly recommend it. And yes, it's dense, but the purpose of reading a book like this is because someone as utterly brilliant as Nietzsche can help you structure your life in a way that you wouldn't be able to do on your own. And it's also important to keep in mind that it's one thing to read and remember a book like Beyond Good and Evil, but it's another thing to take the information Nietzsche provides and apply it to your life. And like I said, you can't do that by objectively knowing you have to. You need to really think about what he says and change your interpretation of certain things so they fit in your value structure. It's a harder process than just memorizing, but in the end, it's far more worth it. And I promise you'll get far more out of Nietzsche than most. So, thank you all so much for watching. I really enjoyed having the chance to talk about some of this philosophy on the channel, and there will certainly be more in the future, but